For the last few decades, the bike industry has been absolutely obsessed with innovation. And don't get me wrong, some of it has been genuinely brilliant. But a lot of it, well, completely pointless. Tech that promised free speed, more comfort, or revolutionary performance, and delivered creaks, complexity, incompatibility, and empty wallet. We were told we needed it, we were told this was the future, and we believed it because it was new, it was shiny, it was aero, and a pro somewhere was riding it. But fast forward a few years, and where is it now? Gone, quietly dropped, or remembered only by mechanics with PTSD. My first nomination for tech fail is a press fit bottom bracket and the multiple standards there have been over the last few decades. How many people right now are triggered by the horrible memory of creaking, squeaking, clicking press fit bottom brackets? Oh my days, there were some disasters out there because for a while it seemed like every bike brand was inventing its own standard of press fit bottom bracket. Cervelo, Trek, everybody was guilty of developing their own standard. And the idea of having so many standards just makes a mockery of the idea of a standard. If there are 20 standards, which one is actually standard? Yeah, I don't know. Crazy situation. Don't know how we got there, why every manufacturer sought their own design standard rather than just embrace one that was more readily available and other brands were using to give the consumer that easier compatibility of fitting the bottom brackets out there and using tools they had already, not have to buy new tools just to fit a special bottom bracket, or make it really tricky to get a spare from your local bike shop when it decided to die on you. And ultimately, all these different standards offer no benefits to us consumers and riders. We are thankfully out of that era, that dark ages of bottom bracket confusion, and a few standards now stand up and risen above all the crap. And I think we're in a good place of bottom bracket reliability and compatibility. So first tech fail is not the press fit bottom bracket itself, but the multiple standards that existed for a reasonable amount of time and made it confusing and difficult to upgrade or maintain your bike yourself. So the press fit concept isn't bad, but the implementation and the chasing of different designs for the sake of it was definitely a tech fail. Before disc brakes came along and rim brakes were king, some bike manufacturers thought it was a smart idea, for some crazy reason, to put the rear brake underneath the chainstay behind the bottom bracket. What were they thinking? The worst place to put a bottom bracket as somebody based in the UK where it rains 9 months of the year, you ride along crappy mud-covered roads, you've got a rear brake down by the bottom of the frame, getting sprayed from all that muck and water from the rear wheel, and all the stuff just runs down the frame into the rear brake. It was a bad idea. I remember riding the original Carnago V1 semi-aero bike, and that had that design. And as well as being a bad place in terms of durability and maintenance and all that crap being sprayed on it, it also really impacted how the brake lever felt, because the cable routing from the brake lever down to the rear stays were really convoluted and meant there's a lot of tension in the rear brake. So the rear brake lever was really hard to pull compared to the front brake lever, which was very light because the brake cable had a shorter distance to go. So bad from a maintenance point of view, that durability, bad from a usability point of view. And yeah, it might have looked okay. It might have meant the rear seat stays had no brake on them, so it looked cleaner and probably marginally more aero, if any at all. But yeah, I don't know what they're thinking. And quite a few bike brands did it. It wasn't just Carnago, there were a handful of bike brands, but thankfully they saw the light of day and abandoned that design. And then disc brakes came along and yeah, the rest is history, as they say. But for a short period of time, if disc brakes hadn't come along, that standard of putting the rear brake down there might have continued. So yeah, thank goodness that didn't continue any further. And another rim brake failure was the early Trek Madone had vector wings. So they put this very complex front brake design to be more aerodynamic because it's an aero bike, to allow the rim brake to turn with a fork and not foul on the wall of the head tube. They put flaps in the head tube. The flaps are open to allow the rim brake to not be obstructed. It looked really cool, it looked funky as heck, but I mean, talk about over-engineered, over-complicated for just a front brake. Yeah, so that thankfully didn't last very long at all. Otherwise I might have seen more bikes like that with crazy complex brakes hidden inside the frame with little flaps allowing them to articulate. So that was a, yeah, what they're thinking moment, big time. As somebody who's covered bike tech for 20 plus years, it's interesting to see brands come out with new technologies and stick with them for a few years and then somewhere along the line abandon it for something else, something better. And one technology that comes to mind are the elastomer inserts that Specialized put into its Roubaix endurance road bike, the zertz insert in the fork and the rear stays. There's loads of talk about how these elastomer inserts in the frame and the fork allowed more compliance and more comfort. But in reality, as it turned out later, it wasn't actually the elastomer itself doing anything. It was just the fact there was a cutout, a hole, and the shaping of the fork and the rear stays allowing that bit of carbon to flex. And it just allowed them to give the marketing claims around the inserts and the extra damping and helping to give the riders in Paris-Roubaix and Tour Flanders, which the bike was designed for and tested in the early days, back before road bikes, race bikes had big tyre clearance, an edge, a competitive advantage over their rivals. But they stuck with it for a few years, that probably 2 or 3 generations of Roubaix with those inserts. But where are they now? They're nowhere. They dropped them a few years ago and moved to a different technology, which makes you wonder how good that technology was in the first place if they don't do it anymore. Was it okay for that time and not okay for a modern bike, or was it just not that good in the first place? And was it all marketing? Was there actual engineering benefits behind that design? I don't know. What do you think? I'd love to hear from you as always. I mean, it looked kind of cool. It's definitely a marketing thing to talk about on the bike showroom floor, but where is it now? Nowhere. Another interesting development in the early days of disc brakes on road bikes was the battle around the through-axle standard. Early disc brake road bikes had a mountain bike 15mm front through-axle and a regular crook release rear axle. But then we moved to 12mm through axles front and rear with a thread on one end, and it just turns in with an Allen key or a lever. If you have that on a bike, some are removable. But a few bike brands try to offer, because one of the issues for the pros at least with disc brakes is a speedy wheel change. And some bike manufacturers try to tackle this with a through axle design that promise a quicker wheel change by allowing that through axle to be removed more quickly. But ultimately, they never caught on. Two come to mind. There's a Mavic speed release, embraced by a few manufacturers, including Candel over the years, and by Focus, the German bike brand, their rapid axle technology, or RAT for short. Both designs had their merits. The Mavic speed release, where a standard fork end has 2 holes for through axle to go through, Mavic had one open and one closed. So the idea is the whole axle didn't have to be removed from the hub, just enough to allow it to drop out thanks to that open end of one side of the fork, and it meant a quicker wheel removal and therefore a quicker wheel reinsertion. But the Focus system had a real benefit and real potential when I used it and tested it on a Focus road bike. But I guess other bike manufacturers didn't want to embrace another bike brand's idea, standard, because bike brands are funny like that. They want to do their own thing, not use somebody else's. We see that with Shimano and SRAM around UDH at the moment. But the Focus system worked really well with this simple T-bar in the end of the axle. So you basically put the axle in, twist it, close the lever. No threading it, just in, twist, go. And I thought it was really easy. Again, like Mavic Speed Release, a bit of a learning curve, but once you were up there, it was fine and easy to use. But because no other bike brands were interested in it, it became a Focus-only technology. And I've not ridden a Focus bike in years. I don't even know if they still use it, but certainly not a technology that caught on, and it could have done. It definitely had potential, but there we are. 2 through axle standards that definitely never caught on. And finally, I'm a big fan of tubeless technology on mountain bikes, gravel bikes, and road bikes. Yes, my road bikes too. But in the early days, over 10 plus years ago, tubeless compatibility, well, compatibility was the wrong word. They weren't compatible. And it was a roulette of wheel, rim, and tyre compatibility. Some worked fine, and many didn't. Some brands tried to introduce standards. There was Shimano and Hutchinson, and Mavic tried to do a sort of road version of their UST mountain bike universal standard technology. But despite those early attempts, the other bike brands, wheel brands, tyre brands didn't get on board, and it meant we had decades of woeful compatibility between tyres and rims, which I think have put back tubeless adoption on road bikes especially back decades. Because if they had agreed on a standard back then, as they have now with the ISO and the ETRTO, the standards around the tyre dimensions and the rim width, which means now, in my experience, a modern tyre on a modern rim, it's no faff, no hassle, goes up with an all track pump first time. If that had been the case 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the adoption, embracing of tubeless would have been much better. But there have been so many horror stories out there. We've all experienced horror stories of tubeless, lack of inflation on rims and tyres that won't go up, or hold air, or know a friend of a friend who's had problems and seen calamities out on the road with tubeless sealant everywhere. In the same way that Aqua Sport Blue and 3T did a lot of damage with one bite on road bikes 10 years ago, damage has been done in the tubeless market and world, which are all a shame because the technology works extremely well. Fewer punches, low pressures with no downsides, no risk of a pinch puncture. And yeah, so that early compatibility nightmare has set back tubeless a long way. So that's a good example of the bike industry not getting together properly, sitting around the same table and having a discussion around a unified standard. And the idea of standards in the bike industry is a bit of a joke, really, isn't it? We're as far away from standards. Well, we're close to standards now, but 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there was no standards. There were lots of different designs, but it wasn't a standard. But now, thankfully, with tubeless at least, there are standards, and means, in my experience at least, they are easy to work with, inflation fine, durability, all that stuff is good. So finally, after 20 plus years, that promise that showed back then has now been delivered. But what a setback indeed.